We're going to be looking at a variety of different things today, so let's just reacquaint ourselves very quickly with sort of a basic map of China. Here is the North China Plain, and here is the Yellow River, which flows, there's the mouth of the Yellow River, into the Bohai, and then, this would be the Yellow Sea out here. The Yellow River actually changed course as shown actually here. This was the mouth before the 1890s. So this little peninsula sticking out here is called the Shandong Peninsula. And we're going to see today how the Germans will kind of gain a control over this in the late 19th century. Up here we see the Liaodong Peninsula, and we're going to learn about the Russians. We're also going to talk a little bit about the Korea. We're going to talk somewhat about the Japanese, which are just right across from China and Korea from the sea, on the Sea of Japan. We're going to talk a little bit about the Manchurian Plains again and those tribes coming out of Mongolia, right? Some of the Mongols. We're going to talk about how Russia moves into this whole area of Siberia, and how they get all the way over here. You see the Amur River, and you see the Amur River here, and then you see another little branch of the river coming down here. That's going to be all very important in what we talk about here today. Let's see, what else? Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, they're very small. You will also see way down here the Pearl River. And right here in the area of the Pearl River, of course, was Canton and Guangzhou, and we're going to learn about that today, as well as out here a Macau, which would become a Portuguese colony. So you're going to hear all about these different places today, so I thought it would be good to kind of refamiliarize yourself with those. First of all, we want to give you a little overview, and where we want to start is kind of where we left off. We were talking about eunuchs at the end of the Ming Dynasty. Today we're going to give you an overview first of the Qing Dynasty, and then we're going to talk about the Chinese and foreigners. Mainly, 95% of it is going to be Qing Dynasty, but we're going to review some things from the Ming Dynasty, as well as mention some things that we've not already mentioned before in terms of the Chinese and foreigners. By the end of the Qing Dynasty, which of course was the last dynasty of China, there were 3,000 eunuchs living in the Forbidden City, and we've already referred to how those eunuchs could sometimes become part of the corrupt practices of the imperial court and of the dynasty. Qing Dynasty China was divided into 18 provinces, and each of those was ruled by a governor, who was usually, by the way, Chinese. And sometimes, if a province were large enough, it would also have a governor general who was usually Manchu. Remember the Qing Dynasty, the last dynasty? Their heritage was Manchu, that is, Manchurian. Each province, in turn, was divided into other units of government, and at the very lowest level stood the district, or xian, is it what's called in Chinese. Now, of districts, there were about 1,500 districts, or xian, in China, ruled by magistrates. And these magistrates did everything at the district level. There was nothing like the separation of powers that you would have seen in Europe, or nothing like the separation of powers that you see in the United States. So there wasn't, an executive and a legislative and a judicial branch. The district official, the magistrate, did everything. So he had to be kind of executive, legislative, and a judge too. And this really mattered, and the reason why we bring all of this up again is it mattered when it came to the whole sense of crime in China. There was no real judicial system in China like existed in Europe. No real rule of law, but rather this whole system was based on virtue. Confucian values. In a group-oriented society such as China, these Confucian values were important in the maintenance of social harmony. So it's social harmony that was valued. And in such a group-oriented society, the family and whatever particular group you were involved in was basically expected to kind of patrol itself, to self-regulate itself. So if a crime occurred, the family or the group was supposed to deal with it. And if for some reason they couldn't deal with it in a harmonious fashion, then that's when the magistrates would need to become involved. And then the magistrates of the districts would usually dictate very harsh punishments. If, for instance, a guilty person could not be found, say, for instance, a murder was committed, well, then there could be family and or group members punished. It was kind of an eye for an eye, an ear for an ear sort of philosophy. And oftentimes, the reason why, again, that you would want to be moral and you would want to be ethical and you would want not to commit any crimes is not only because of the Confucian values of the society, because if you did and you were caught, members of your family and or your group might also be punished, even if they were innocent. So there was no individual right to a trial. Punishments really served to instill fear, and by that, to make certain that harmony, social harmony, was maintained. Now, having said that, it might seem somehow illogical, or at least it would seem ironic. It's not really contradictory because you'll see there's some distinctions to be made here. Corruption was rampant in many of the dynasties of China, and certainly the Qing dynasty was one of those. Part of the reason why was Chinese officials really received only rather small salaries. Sometimes, obviously, they received land, etc., but out of those salaries and so forth, they were responsible for paying their own staff. They were responsible for, again, in a nation, a country, a society where things are very group-oriented, they would have to help out relatives. And furthermore, if a Chinese official really wanted a nice government post, to get the nice ones, they had to bribe, whoever was in charge of making certain that that government post would be assigned to them. And it was accepted in the society that government officials were allowed to charge what is sometimes seen as, quote, customary dues, end quote. And these customary dues, of course, would sometimes lead to corruption, because obviously there was no place where the customary dues were written down. So, you could really kind of try to extort perhaps as much money as you might on these customary dues, and always at the bottom of the heap would be the poor peasants who would be trying to pick up all of the cost of the government and its corruption. The central government depended upon the provincial and local magistrates to collect taxes, which really fell into three types of taxes: land taxes, customs duties, and also monopolies on such things, for instance, as salt. And of course, there was, in the collection of taxes, further corruption here, not only in squeezing peasants, but also in, again, the local and provincial magistrates were expected to take a certain percentage of this for themselves, and only a certain amount of it would get to the emperor. However, quite a lot didn't really make it to the emperor in the end. Now, so far as the peasants were concerned, they practiced equal division of land among their male offspring. So a son would pass on, divide up his land to his sons. This is, of course, opposite to many areas of Europe at the time that were practicing primogeniture, where you give it to the eldest son, which again, I think we discussed this, might seem like it's not fair, but it helps to prevent this endemic cycle from occurring. So you can see what's happening here as there's corruption and the peasants are squeezed for taxes in addition to all these kind of customary dues. And the peasants are continuing to divide generation to generation their land equally among the male offspring, that by the 19th century, that is by the 1800s, the average size of a farm in North China was only 3 acres. And in South China, it was only half of that, 1.5 acres. In the meantime, the population of China was burgeoning. By 1644, at the beginning of the Qing dynasty, it was somewhere in the range of 150 to 180 million people. By 1790, it was 330 million people. Let's put that in perspective. That is more people by about 16, 17 million than the United States currently has. So this was, of course, the world's largest country, and it was very populous. By 1850, the population of China was as high as 400 million people. Well, that's all you needed was a flood to occur, a drought, whatever, and famines might come along. For example, in 1877-78, there was a famine in 4 northern Chinese provinces, and that famine alone resulted in the death of some 9 to up to 13 million people. Well, we always said that if the peasants weren't satisfied with things, that these famines or floods or, droughts, anything could come along, and that might be a sign that the mandate of heaven has fallen from a ruler. And so peasants had the right to rebel. If they rebelled and it was a successful rebellion and they put someone new on the throne, be it a peasant or a general, whoever it might be, then that was seen as heaven giving the mandate of heaven to that new ruler. If, for some reason, those peasant rebellions or other rebellions failed, then it was because obviously heaven, had not had in mind the passing on of the dynasty at that time. So there were many secret societies throughout China which had their own rituals, their own symbols, and often they were the secret societies that would lead rebellion. Already by 1796, a number of Chinese were unhappy with the situation in China, and the White Lotus Society, one of these secret societies, led a 9-year rebellion. It was eventually quelled by the government, but like all rebellions and all wars, it was very costly for the government to put it down. Well, what we want to do now is look at the European incursion into China. And first of all, we want to do some review from the Ming Dynasty, which was the dynasty preceding the Qing Dynasty. The first Portuguese who came to China did so in 1513 at the mouth of the Pearl River near what today is Macau. By 1535, the Ming Dynasty allowed the Portuguese to live and trade at Macau. And in 1557, the Portuguese gained the right to actually rent the Macau Peninsula from the Chinese. So the Portuguese were pretty strongly entrenched, and they're trading at Macau. Again, the reason for trying to keep the Portuguese on this peninsula was a couple of things. You have to remember that in the Chinese view of things, merchants and trading, that was really considered rather a lowly thing. It was a necessary thing, but they were even considered, at least below in the social scale. Not necessarily the economic scale, but in the social scale, they were even considered below the peasants. So, they didn't want these merchants and these traders, Chinese or Portuguese, European, whoever, to kind of infiltrate the general society of China, kind of put them off to the side. And secondly, of course, remember the Chinese thought that they were the middle kingdom, the heavenly kingdom, right? The emperor was the son of heaven, and everybody else, the Portuguese, the Russians, the British, the Mongols, everyone, they were beneath the Chinese. They were seen as foreigners. They were literally called barbarians. Jesuit priest. And that is, they were a member of the Society of Jesus of the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church has lots of different religious orders. The Jesuit priests are known for their learning, for their intellectual endeavors. They were founded after the Reformation. They formed many universities throughout Europe, and of course, they would form the first Catholic university in the United States, Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. They run Xavier University in Cincinnati and many universities throughout the United States, in Europe, and the world. So please don't think that Jesuit priests are somehow not Roman Catholics. For those people who aren't familiar with the Roman Catholic Church, it's just an order of priests that one can join if one wants to say, maybe you would want to join the Society of Jesus Jesuit Priest if you were inclined to be a teacher. Maybe you would join another order of priests like the Franciscans if you wanted to serve the poor and help the poor and feed the poor, okay? But they're all part of the Catholic Church. They just have different missions as to what they do as priests. And of course, nuns, etc., have also these orders as well. So Jesuit priests first came to Macau. They had been allowed to go to China, and their Jesuits, as I said, were very respected for their learning. And in China, the Chinese especially respected them for their understanding of geography and mathematics, but especially their understanding of astronomy. Because what had happened was the Chinese calendar had gotten all out of sync. And that might not seem like a major thing, except remember the Chinese emperor performed all of these rituals, religious rituals. And those religious rituals depended upon knowing the proper date of things. And the calendar had fallen astray, so the Jesuits showed them how their calendar, due to their astronomical sightings, was actually more accurate. And so the Chinese used those changes to their calendar. Now, the Jesuits were very understanding of other cultures. So when they went to China, the Jesuit priests started to dress like Chinese scholars, and they adopted Chinese customs. And they even began to regard Confucianism as a secular moral system similar to Christianity. They felt that China was ripe for Christianization. In fact, a number of of people in the imperial court, scholars, converted to Christianity. But please know that the Jesuits were not pushy about this. And when the Chinese did convert, they did not require the Chinese converts to stop their ancestral worship. This would later on get them in trouble with the Vatican, but you can read about that if you want to. That's not part of our discussion now. The emperor regarded the Jesuits as serving him and his imperial court. Perhaps the most famous of the Jesuits who came to China was Matteo Rizzi, who wrote a book about the Chinese that was published posthumously, after his death. And that's a book that people still read to see, what kind of Ming Dynasty China looked at least from European perspective. Now, Russia had, from the 1570s on, supported Cossacks. Now, first of all, we have to explain who Cossacks were. Cossacks originally came from the area of Ukraine in Russia, And they included runaway peasants, runaway criminals, adventurers. They were kind of a motley group of people. They included Turks and Greeks, people from other countries, people from the Ukraine. But one thing they were good fighters and they were courageous. And so Russia really wanted to kind of move eastward across the Ural Mountains. And you recall that one of the kind of dividing points between Europe and Asia is the Ural Mountains. And Russia wanted to move over the Ural Mountains into the area of Siberia. And so it supported the Cossacks and some of the Russian families, to move eastward across the Ural Mountains from the 1570s on. Thereafter, throughout the 1600s, the Russians moved into Siberia, and there they established ostrogi, or forts. And the reason why they were interested in Siberia, because you might say, gee, isn't that very, very cold? Yes, it was very, very cold, but it was rich in furs, gold, and silver. Furs, gold, and silver. Now, if we continue the story of the Russians, but now turn to the Qing dynasty, which comes into play in 1644. By the 1650s, there were some 50,000 Russians in Siberia. And it's estimated that by 1660, furs were providing 1/3 of all the Russian imperial court's treasury receipts. So Siberia was very important to the treasury, very important to the economy. But the Russians, certainly in Siberia could not really grow any food. Siberia is too cold. They needed food supplies. Siberia was too cold to provide them. So by the 1650s, the Russians started to move into the Amur River Valley region. Now, this could prove, and did prove, problematic because the Chinese considered both sides of the Amur River to be their possession. So the Chinese emperor sent a military expedition to expel the Russians, and that works for a while. Meanwhile, about 1660, Prince Goldan, a leader of the Dzungar Mongols, he united various tribes, as well for a time being as the Dalai Lama of Tibet, against China. And by the 1670s, he came to control the area of Xinjiang. Meanwhile, so there's two things the Qing dynasty is having to worry about on its northeastern and northwestern borders, and that was the Russians moving in and Prince Goldan and the Dzungar Mongols. Anyhow, so in the meantime, the Russians were moving back into the Amur River region. So the Chinese worried that the Russians might ally themselves with the Mongols. And on the other hand, the Russians worried that the Chinese might ally themselves with the Mongols. So things were pretty good, at least at this point in time, for the two to sit down with one another and arrive at a treaty. The Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689. By that treaty, Russia largely abandoned the Amur River Valley, but it held on to a trading post at Nerchinsk, which was one of these fortifications. The Chinese, meanwhile, had successfully taken Formosa, which we now call Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, in 1683. And so having, dealt with the Russians and dealt with the problems in Taiwan, it was now possible for the emperor to handle the situation, or he thought so, with Prince Goldan of the Dzungar Mongols. In 1718, the Mongols invaded Tibet. So the Chinese stationed troops in the Tibetan capital of Lhasa. The Dzungar Mongols then were controlled for a while, but like the Russians, they're like bubbles. They keep appearing and then, they're popped and then they reappear, etc. The Mongols reemerged in the 1730s, but were finally defeated by China in 1756, at which time about 500,000 Dzungar Mongols were killed. So this was a major effort on China's part to secure its borders. Remember, we're going to keep going back to that theme of implosion. Internal decay, a weakening at the periphery, a weakening on the borders. You know, you have to keep everything strong on the borders so that you're not prone to, vulnerable to attacks, and internally as well. Well, the Chinese Emperor Kangxi died in 1722, and the Russian Tsar Peter the Great died in 1725, so with new emperors in both places, a new treaty was possible in 1727, the Treaty of Kyakhta. And in this, the Russians were given a kind of quasi-consulate and trading area in Beijing. Now, this is amazing. If you recall, the Chinese did not allow any embassies in Beijing because, for one thing, it would pollute their society to have these foreigners hanging around. But the other thing would be, if you had an embassy from a foreign nation, it would be a recognition that that foreign nation was an equal to you. And remember, China just regarded all these people like the Russians as vassals. You know, if they came to see the emperor in Beijing, they would bring gifts. He would give them bigger gifts. They would be seen as tributary states. So something amazing is happening in this treaty in 1727, where they're not really calling it an embassy, but they're allowing the Russians to set up this kind of quasi-embassy consulate, complete with a little trading area in Beijing, the capital of China, where they were also allowed to build a Russian Orthodox church. So Russia was regarded basically as kind of an equal, if not an equal power, at least a power to be contended with. Now we're going to look at how the Europeans begin to divide up. This is a little editorial cartoon that appeared in one of the 19th century newspapers and was reprinted in Robert Bicker's excellent book called The Scramble for China. If you're interested in any of this kind of history, I highly recommend his book. It's 2011. Well, during the Qing dynasty, the Dutch started trading at Formosa, Taiwan, as did the Spanish. So, you know, you've got everybody kind of involved in trading in China, and what they need to do, the Chinese, is they need to somehow control all of these Europeans in the trading. So what they came up with was called the Canton, or today the city is known as Guangzhou, the Canton or Guangzhou system. So this is in the southern part of China. This is down in the area of the Pearl River, Guangzhou, Pearl River, Macau area. In the far, far south. And the Chinese government used merchants, Chinese merchants called the Kohong. Now, these Chinese merchants, the Kohong, were granted a monopoly by the government to trade with the Europeans. Okay, so they have to deal with everything with the Europeans. The emperor did appoint a Chinese official called the Hopo to oversee the Kohong and to collect customs duties. Now, what they decided was a very, very closed system, the Canton system. And the Europeans could really only be involved in Canton or Guangzhou during the trading season, which was October through March. And these were the stipulations. The Europeans had to stay in their factories, and they were called factories, although they weren't factories in the sense that we know them as factories. They were kind of combination warehouses and residences, and they were outside the city walls of Guangzhou. The Europeans could not bring their wives or family, nor could the Europeans enter the city of Guangzhou. The Europeans were subject to Chinese laws and customs. For example, if they were committed a crime, they were not entitled to extraterritoriality. Extraterritoriality means, like if you are a member, say, of an embassy in Washington, D.C., and you commit a crime, then, we're going to let that embassy handle your crime, right? It's as if, say, the British embassy owned that little part of Washington, D.C. It's considered extraterritoriality. In 1821, for instance, an American sailor aboard the Emily accidentally dropped something off the ship that killed a Chinese lady in a boat, and the Americans had to turn him over to the Chinese who strangled him. So this was not something the Americans were really comfortable with. The Europeans, Americans, the foreigners had to deal directly with the Cohong. Now, as inferiors, they could send petitions through the Cohong to government officials, but the Europeans, Americans, etc., the foreigners, the barbarians, could not deal with officials personally. Only the Cohong could. And by the way, only the Cohong knew the customs duties. These weren't written down anyplace. So the Cohong could change the customs duties. They could manipulate them. This opened things up to the floodgates of bribes and corruption. The Europeans could not even send ambassadors, send ambassadors to Beijing. In Chinese eyes, to do so would be to recognize the equality of another monarch. And in the off-season, the Europeans had to move off to Macau. Well, now this was something that was not particularly popular, as I said, with the foreigners. But let's first talk a little bit about the British East India Company. The British Parliament had chartered, as a monopoly, the British East India Company to conduct trade on behalf of British citizens in Asia. And the British East India Company bought tea in China. This is very important because in the 18th and 19th centuries, that is, in the 1700s and the 1800s, tea became a very popular drink in Britain. So the British wanted their tea, they bought tea from China. They also loved, the British people and people everywhere liked silk, which was produced in China, porcelain, which we've already talked about. Its name is, in fact, China when we talk about porcelain. Lacquerware, which, lac tree, sap and so forth from the lac tree is made into this mixture and then put over and made kind of a shiny surface to wood cabinets and furniture, lacquerware. It can be made into bowls, etc., wooden bowls covered with lacquer. Lacquerware was very popular. Now, in order to buy all of this in China, the Europeans, the British, etc., had to pay for it in silver. The Chinese wanted silver, but they didn't really want anything else from the West except silver. And so for a long time, the British had a trade deficit with China, and, Britain was bleeding silver to China. Which brings us to the topic of opium. While the Chinese had long used opium medicinally, mainly as a painkiller, addiction levels to opium among the Chinese grew astronomically during this period, as both European and American traders smuggled opium into China. For 110 years, from 1729 to 1839, the Chinese had passed numerous edicts making the importation, sale, or use of opium illegal. Still, smuggling continued. And amazingly, Britain's trade deficit with China shifted when the individual sailors of the British East India Company, now individual sailors were allowed to bring like one chest, personal chest, wooden chest of stuff to trade in China. So while the British East India Company wasn't bringing in opium, their sailors would buy opium in Italy, put it in their little individual wooden chests to China, and sell it to smugglers and even to the Cohong. And this became a major problem because the Chinese were buying the opium with silver, and silver started to leave China right and left. The price of silver rose, and the exchange rate of silver to copper coins, got all out of whack, squeezing the peasants further because the peasants were expected to pay their taxes in silver. Now, keep that in mind, and keep also in mind that the British government wanted to see embassies, commercial treaties with stated customs duties, more ports open to European traders, the right to send Christian missionaries into China. So to try to achieve all these things, the British tried on several occasions to send envoys to Beijing. The first one they sent was Colonel Charles Cathcart, who died before he got to Beijing, so that didn't amount to anything. Then they sent Lord George Macartney in 1793. Well, he gets to Beijing and he refused to kowtow to the Chinese Emperor Qianlong. He only knelt. He brought gifts from the British king. The emperor was not very impressed with any of those and thought that Macartney was rude for not kowtowing. The Chinese regarded his visit as that of a tribute state, and the gifts as tribute. It refused to accede to any of the British suggestion. The emperor sent gifts back to the British king and a letter noting, and this is what the Chinese emperor said, that, quote, our dynasty's majestic virtue has penetrated unto every country under heaven, and kings of all nations have offered their costly tribute by land and sea. As your ambassador can see for himself, we possess all need, and place no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufacturers, end quote. In terms of the British proposals, that they send ambassadors and so forth, the emperor responded with a very long explanation of why all of these British proposals would not work, and indeed stated, quote, it may be, O king, that the above proposals have been wantonly made by your ambassador on his own responsibility, or peradventure you yourself are ignorant of our dynastic regulations and had no intention of transgressing them when you expressed all these wild ideas and hopes. So the Chinese thought these were just wild, crazy ideas. The Chinese didn't operate in this according to the new law, the international laws and rules and regulations. Trade and diplomacy, all of that was growing up and becoming very popular. In Europe, they didn't understand any of that, and they didn't care to understand any of that. And you could see where the two were really at odds because Lord Macartney went back to Britain and reported that China was, quote, like an old crazy first man of war. A man of war was a naval ship. He continued, she may perhaps not sink outright. She may drift some time as a wreck and will then be dashed to pieces on the shore, but she can never be rebuilt on the old bottom, end quote. Lord Macartney saw that if China didn't change, she was going to be dashed to pieces like a ship on the shore. And of course, that was what ended up happening, as we'll see in a minute. Lord Amherst was a third person sent by the British in 1816 this time. Again, Amherst refused to kowtow, and he was basically sent packing. The Emperor Qing sent a nasty note back to the British king saying, quote, your ambassadors are ignorant of our Chinese etiquette. Though we have repeatedly instructed them, they pay no heed. There is no need for you to send an embassy on this long and tiring journey, end quote. Basically, thanks but no thanks, and don't send any more ambassadors to Beijing because you're wasting your time. Now, as all of this is occurring, in Britain, gaining momentum was the idea of free trade. And by free trade, we mean trade should not be restricted by the government. The government, it should be laissez-faire, hands off the economy. So the one thing that free traders disliked more than anything was monopolies. And the British East India Company had a monopoly on British trade with Asia. So the British East India Company monopoly was ended in 1834. Well, that brings us up to the 1830s, and we're going to see here the First Opium War. The Chinese decided to crack down on the opium trade. It ordered all foreign merchants in Guangzhou, in Canton, to give up their opium and to promise never to trade in opium again. Meanwhile, until things got better, the Chinese stopped trading with the foreigners at Guangzhou. Now, the British official there complied, turning over opium, but he refused to sign the promise, the bond, that this would never occur again, because he feared that if even one sailor was caught in the future, that the Chinese might require the entire ship of sailors to be punished by the Chinese. And so the Americans actually signed, turned over the opium, signed the agreement, the promise, and so the Chinese reopened trade to the Americans. But since the British had not signed the pledge, they did not reopen trade to the British. Meanwhile, some drunken British sailors had killed a Chinese man, and the Chinese demanded that the murderer be turned over to them. Well, the British decided to handle this, by themselves, and in fact, they didn't know exactly who the murderer was. So they refused to turn over any of their sailors, and they knew that things were going to get even worse. So the British took all their ships and brought them to the area of Hong Kong, and war erupted. Now, the war ended in the Treaty of Nanking in 1843 and also Treaty of the Bogue in 1843. And by these, 9 different things happened. The Chinese ceded, because the Chinese lost the First Opium War, the Chinese ceded Hong Kong to Great Britain. The Chinese had to pay an indemnity. The Chinese opened the ports of Guangzhou, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai to trading and to foreign residency. That's something new. The Kohong was abolished. Fixed customs duties were established, so you wouldn't have to guess what they were. Foreign consuls at treaty ports would be allowed to communicate with Chinese officials. They granted extraterritoriality or consular jurisdiction for foreigners at treaty ports so they could handle, again, their own crimes and so forth. And Britain was offered most favored nation status by Treaty of the Bogue, which meant that if the Chinese signed any treaties with any other nation and maybe gave some other concession to that nation, then Britain would automatically get that same concession. Treaties were subject to revision in 12 years. Now, what they did not settle and what was left unsettled was the opium question and the whole idea of embassies. And that would kind of emerge later on in the Second Opium War, which went from 1857 to 1860. The real cause of the Second Opium War was the continuing conflict between the Chinese and European views of international relations. The immediate causes included the capture and execution of a French Catholic priest, as well as the arrest of some Chinese sailors aboard a ship that was sailing under the British flag. That British ship was called the Arrow, and this arrest of the Chinese sailors was called the Arrow Affair. So having upset both the British and the French, Anglo-French forces unite and are at war with China. They took Beijing, and the British burned the summer palace of the emperor. The treaties of Tianjin and the Beijing Convention in 1858 and 1860 opened 11 new ports to the foreigners for trading, including Tianjin. It also granted foreigners the right to travel within China. Now that was unheard of. And better yet, it allowed foreign envoys, foreign ambassadors, to be sent to and to live in Beijing. So now the whole idea of embassies is going to become a possibility for the first time for other places other than Russia, which already kind of had a quasi-embassy. Also, Britain got the Kowloon Peninsula, which was opposite Hong Kong as well. So Britain made out very well. The Europeans made out very well. It still didn't settle all of the problems, obviously, that Russia had as well. In the Amur region, Nikolai Muravyov, Governor General of Siberia, had been putting pressure on the Qing dynasty, and again, this is unrelated to the Second Opium War. He had been putting pressure on the Qing dynasty since 1847, and in 1860, the entire area north of the Amur River was ceded to the Russians, who also received lands east of the Ussuri River, later on incorporated into the Russian Empire. And Muravyev also founded the city of Vladivostok, and Russia got most favored nation status as well. So some of these gains, by the way, remain a source of conflict between the Russians and Chinese today in terms of the actual territory. Well, you see what's happening. China was being carved up by outside powers, by external powers. It was experiencing weakness on its peripheries. It was also experiencing internal decay. For 14 years, the Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864 raged throughout China, led by Hong Xianquan, who thought of himself as the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He took Nanjing as his capital, the capital of what he called the so-called Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. He proposed to divide the land equally among the peasants and even to emancipate women. So he had some radical ideas. Obviously, lots of people followed him. And during the rebellion, up to 30 million people died. It was finally suppressed, but and Nanjing fell in 1864. But again, things were very costly, both in terms of lives and in the militias that quelled the rebellion. There were all kinds of smaller rebellions by secret societies, some of them related to the White Lotus Society. There was a Muslim rebellion in Yunnan. There was another rebellion called the Dongan Rebellion in the northwest. So rebellions were happening throughout China. And then there were dynastic weaknesses as well. The Emperor Xianfeng, born in 1831, reigned from 1851 to 1861. The Second Opium War occurred during his reign. Qi, so-called the Empress Dowager later on, or the Old Buddha, she was the mother of Emperor Shifeng's only son and his 4-year-old heir, Tongzhi. And she actually kind of took control of the empire in the late 19th century. When he died, she would become the Empress Dowager, literally widow. They called her the Old Buddha. And she would come to control things very tightly. Even though she wasn't, the ruler in name, she controlled things behind the scene. So Tongzhi was born in 1856. He reigned 61 to 75, but only came of age in 1873, and then he died shortly thereafter. Emperor Guangxu was born in 1873, reigned 1875 to 1908. You can see what's happening here, who's going to be controlling things, because obviously at 2 years old, you can't be controlling things. He died in 1908, one day before Qi, and he probably was poisoned, maybe, through the orders of Qi. Because Qi wanted her 3-year-old, I think, nephew, Puyi, to become the next heir. And then in all of this, we need to look at someone who had become, for all intents and purposes, like a de facto foreign minister of China, and that is Li Hongzhang. And I would not at all say that he was, responsible for any of the internal decay. He was actually one of the leaders of modernization, and one of his proteges would be Yuan Shikai, and we'll look at him next week. We also have to look a little bit about what was happening in Southeast Asia. Vietnamese history is best viewed with attention to really three geographical divisions: North, Central, and South Vietnam. North Vietnam, under the Han Dynasty, had been annexed to China in 111, and they held on to it for about 800 years when a native North Vietnamese dynasty took control. For a short period of time during the Ming Dynasty, which of course preceded the Qing Dynasty, China again dominated North Vietnam for about 20 years until a North Vietnamese dynasty was established. And that North Vietnamese dynasty lasted all the way up into 1789, its capital based at Hanoi. Central Vietnam, Annam, was ruled by the Nguyen dynasty. South Vietnam was called Annam, and it also was ruled by the Nguyen dynasty. And eventually, from about 1859 through 1867, France gained control of South Vietnam and really kind of created a protectorate over Cambodia, and forced Annam, Vietnam to cede some of its three eastern provinces to its control. Certainly by 1874, in practice, Annam was a French protectorate. Although it technically retained its independence, Vietnam became a protectorate, and in fact, Annam in 1883 became an outright protectorate of France. The Sino-French War, which is, of course, Sino-Chinese-French War of 1884-85, arose in response to the French takeover of Annam. And as we said, in 1883, they outright declared a protectorate over Annam. China advanced troops into Tonkin. War was not officially declared by China. Fighting occurred in Vietnam, on Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, and along the nearby coast of China. Proper, the Chinese troops suffered a humiliating defeat in March 1884, and the hostilities were finally ended by negotiation. In 1887, the French unified their administrative control over both Vietnam and Cambodia. By 1893, they acquired Laos, which had long been in a dispute between Siam and Annam. So the French were making Southeast Asian gains in territory. In 1886, Britain annexed Burma, which, again was a neighbor. So these are all neighbors of China. And in 1887, China gave over, C-E-D-E-D, Macau to Portugal, officially recognizing the de facto situation there. Further losses would come in the area of Korea during the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895. Korea had long been a tributary state of China. It was called the Hermit Kingdom, and basically it allowed China to conduct its foreign affairs. In an effort to contain Japanese expansionism, the de facto Prime Minister Li Hongzhang of China dispatched Yuan Shikai to Korea with Chinese troops. In 1894-95, a domestic rebellion erupted in Korea, and the Korean ruler requested Chinese help in squelching the revolt. But the Japanese, regarding Korea as an independent state, also sent troops. The Sino-Japanese War resulted in a humiliating defeat for China. By terms of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, China was forced to recognize Korea as an independent nation. Japan received in China the Liaodong Peninsula, and they had to actually turn it back because the Europeans were not happy with that idea. But the Japanese were allowed to take the Pescadores Islands and Taiwan. So Japan came out with other pieces which China regarded as part of its tributary territory. China was also required to pay an indemnity to Japan, and Japan was granted the most favored nation status. The Sino-Japanese War contributed to the financial problems of China. The Chinese borrowed money from abroad to finance the war, and after the end of hostilities, they secured further loans to meet the cost of the indemnity to Japan. And Franco-Russian and Anglo-German banking syndicates readily loaned funds to China, but they secured those against customs revenues. Thereafter, China's debt drained the country, which of course would inflame native Chinese revolutionaries against foreigners in general. And so we see what's actually going to happen here. So the Russians are moving into this area up here. The Japanese have taken over Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands. Over here are the Philippines, controlled by Spain. And then here you have the British area, Protectorate, Canton or Guangzhou, Hong Kong, Macau, they're all down here. You see the British up in this area. The Boxer Rebellion we'll do next week is up in this area, but we also see the Germans that will be moving into the Shandong Peninsula, which is right here, and the Russians moving into this area, etc., etc. And we come to the conclusion. In 1896, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was crowned, and the Chinese de facto Prime Minister Li Hongzhang attended the ceremonies, and during the course of his visit, he signed a secret defense pact with Russia against Japan, and at the same time, he secured the right for the Russians to build a trans-Siberian railway across Manchuria to Vladivostok. In 1898 was the year of the leases. In 1898, Germany obtained from China a 99-year lease, an exclusive right to build railroads and open mines in the Shandong Peninsula. Russia in the same year negotiated a lease of the very important city of Port Arthur and of Dalian on the Liaodong Peninsula. And this is going to be important because, remember, this is what the Japanese wanted and the Europeans made them give back. Britain secured a 99-year lease of the new territories adjacent to the Kowloon area of Hong Kong. So we can see what's going to happen. Next week we'll look at revolutionaries internally in China. Any questions? Please feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help. Thank you and have a good week.